My name is Kuntala Lahiri-Dutt. I'm a professor at the Australian National University. I'm very pleased to be chairing this session today. Australia India Institute runs a fellows series of seminars, and I'm really pleased to chair Dr. Haripriya Rangan. She'll be talking about denationalizing Indian environmental issues today. Let me introduce Haripriya in case you don't know her. Haripriya Rangan began her academic life as a student of architecture and wandered through urban planning and regional development to discover her preoccupation with biocultural geography, political ecology, and environmental histories of the Indian Ocean world. She has done research on forestry, regional development, and the well-known Chipko movement in the Garhwal Himalayas, the economic geography of the medicinal plant trade in South Africa, and on the political ecology of plant transfers around the Indian Ocean, with particular focus on exchanges between Southern and Eastern Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Northern Australia. The latter work has involved collaborations with researchers from natural, social, and historical sciences and indigenous community organizations in each of these regions. These collaborations have enabled her to see the beauty and richness of the Indian Ocean as an old, cosmopolitan, and creolized world of movements, connections, and interactions. Haripriya is a principal fellow and associate professor at the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and an academic fellow of the Australia India Institute. Thank you, Haripriya. It's your now. You'll be talking for about 30 minutes, and then we giving us the chance to have some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kuntala, for your introduction. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and I pay my respects to the elders of this country, past, present, and emerging. I'm actually delighted to be able to have this chance to speak on this forum, the seminar forum. And just as a kind of context, I really had a hard time trying to find an appropriate title to capture what I really wanted to say about environmental issues today, how to think about it. So I just want to clarify that when I came up with this term denationalizing, I didn't imply any kind of privatization agenda. And rather, I just wanted to somehow capture the need to think outside of this box of nationalism that we tend to get ourselves into when we talk about environmental issues. Just want to clarify that I also am not today going to address the real politic of Indian environmental issues at the sort of national level. That's not really my agenda today. What I want to do today is kind of think of how we might fundamentally shift the way we talk about environments in the Indian context. I think this is necessary if we want emerging generations in India, in the Indian subcontinent, South Asia, to have a wider range of lifescapes which allow them to live well and with dignity. So it was when I was just thinking about this talk, and when it, the scheduling of this talk, I realized that August, we're at the end of August, but August is usually a month that sees a sort of rise of nationalist jingoism that reaches a kind of crescendo on around 15th August, and around the annual celebration day of Indian independence from colonial rule. But the reality is that most of the discourses of development and national greatness that have emerged over the past 75 odd years can't necessarily hide the direct resonances between national and colonial mentalities when it comes to approaching environmental issues. So nationalist claims about India's natural environment are usually cloaked in virtuous, sugar-coated sentiment, but are usually turbocharged adaptations of colonial instruments and centralized modes of political and corporate exploitation and profiteering in the name of national development. There's a lot of virtue signaling about the greatness of culture and traditional knowledge, but all the people who have actually got the most intimate knowledge and adaptive understanding of different environments are routinely marginalized and displaced and pauperized by these kinds of nationalist agendas. Now, just to broaden a slight context of where I'm coming from, as Kuntala provided in the introduction, I've been looking at the Indian Ocean world, both over the long-term perspective as well as the more recent interactions in terms of mobility, exchange of plants, and how the landscapes have been shaped by these interactions around the Indian Ocean. And one of the things that comes out when you do this kind of work, which is not just locally focused, or nationally focused, but you look at this region from the ocean and you look at the lands around it, you realize that the Indian Ocean world is not just ancient and cosmopolitan and an extraordinarily rich human ocean, but that there is something very striking and distinctive about it. Just about everything and every activity in that ocean and the lands embaying it is linked to two things: monsoons and mobility. So if you look at so many books and materials going way back, the monsoon is such a big narrative in defining the Indian Ocean region. And the monsoon literally creates the rhythms of movement and mobility. The monsoons define the life worlds in this region. And particularly so in the subcontinent, which is literally kind of shaped by the rhythms, these annual rhythms and the rhythms of the monsoon. So this is not being environmental determinist. I'm not saying that everything is defined by the climate, as it were. But I'm just recognizing the rhythms of this world and how it's shaped. It's a monsoon world. I think of the Indian subcontinent in particular as a kind of land comprising rainscapes, which are intimately tied to the people's sense of their place, their country, or what, in Hindi they say desh, or in Tamil they say nadu. And, if you just go back and you listen to the Northern Indian classical, raga desh, you'll see that the sound and the lyrics that are often invoked or sung, they are always about the rains, the return of the husband or the lover who has gone away somewhere to work, who's come back, who has to cross these, swelling rivers, and coming back together. If you think of, great classical Sanskrit poetry of Kalidasa, then you have the Meghdut, and the Meghdut being the cloud messenger that is carrying messages between two lovers. And you think about in Tamil, the classic Sangam literature, it talks about different sensibilities within the Nadu or the country, which are called Thinais. I don't know if many of you have heard this term, Thinai. But in some sense, they are a kind of rainscape. They define the kind of vegetation, the sensibility of each of these kinds of spaces, whether they are the mountains or the forest or the agricultural, the fluvial plains of the Kaveri River, the the sort of dry lands, parched lands, which don't get as much, semi-arid areas, which don't get as much rain, and the littoral areas, the nadir. And so, when I look, and this, I give you these examples from Tamil because I've been, that's sort of my background. I'm a Tamil. I'm of Tamil background, but more broadly speaking, whether you talk about Desh or whichever part, whichever language, you have particular kinds of ways in describing the land, which are intimately related with the kind of rainfall or moisture and so on and so forth that shapes that country. And the point that I'm trying to get at, in terms of fundamentally rethinking how we think about environmental issues, is that we need to start looking in the Indian context at environmental issues, perhaps through this lens of monsoon and mobility, rather than from the way they are currently approached in terms of land and natural resources, which is a very colonial and exploitative perspective. Even when people talk about climate change today, they keep talking about all the threats and disasters associated with floods and drought and glaciers melting and sea level rise and so on. But they never actually think about it in terms of the fact that monsoons are the ones that are actually shaping these patterns. They're creating the rhythms of life, and they are creating rainscapes that are also changing alongside all of these other things that are happening alongside climate change. So we need to think of these. So I'm arguing that we need to think about monsoons and mobility, and that we need to see the people who live and move and migrate today as not doing something that didn't happen before, but that the patterns have changed. But we need to see that mobility is also a part of that kind of something that needs to be taken into account when we're thinking about environmental issues as a normal activity rather than as an abnormal one, where people are going to be displaced from the threats of this or that or the other, right? And we need to see them as people who have always not just stayed in place, but who have moved around, migrated, come back, then they've developed constantly, are finding ways and have developed strategies to do all of these things as climate and economic patterns change. And this is something that we need to actually change the way we look at. So basically what I'm trying to figure out, and these are just, my early ideas, this is something I'm working on. So I'm always going to look forward to any advice and ideas that you have. But what I'm suggesting is that we look at environmental issues like climate change adaptation in terms of rainscapes, monsoon and mobility. And that means looking at watery environments in a completely different way. So this brings me to the kind of work that has been done in South Asia. And all I can say is that the scholarship on rivers and waters in India, amazing scholarship. It's just the most incredibly rich theoretically and empirically empirically rich work that you can find. And I've been doing a fair bit of searching on that. And I'm so pleased. I was very, very pleased that Kuntala agreed to chair my talk, because she is one of the leading scholars in doing this kind of rich work about rivers in a very, very original and innovative way. Look, her work on the Chars, on the Damodar River, and the work of the and what goes on in the Gangetic Delta is just unbelievably wonderful, both theoretically, empirically. And her colleague Gopa Samanta, there's Amita Bhaviskar, Rohan D'Souza, who's done work on the Mahanadi. Amita has done work on the Narmada. Then you have people like Arup Jyoti Saikia, who's done work on the Brahmaputra, and people, I could just go on, Anuradha Mathur, Dilip Dakunya, that have done incredibly rich work. And then there are all these people who are from Pakistan and Bangladesh, Danish Mustafa, Farhana Sultana, and it can go on, and other scholars too from the US and the UK, David Moss, Kasia Paprocki, Jason Cons, Willem van Schendel, and so on and so forth. They've all been doing wonderful work. There's been great work by historians, people like Sunil Amrit, who's Sujit Sivasundaram, and other people like Ajanta Subramaniam has done work on littoral societies. And what I really want to get back to is that what all of this scholarship shows us is the kind of regionalized rainscapes that are created by monsoons and mobility. And this is the kind of perspective I feel we need to use if we want to address the environmental issues that are now being talked about in terms of climate change, whether it's floods or drought or water shortage or anything in cities and rural areas. So, yeah, I've been thinking about these issues, thinking about rainscapes, and mind you, like I said, I'm looking at it from a kind of a view from the ocean, as it were, from the Indian Ocean world. How do I look at the Indian subcontinent? And why is it important to do that? Because otherwise, if we look at narrow time frames, we don't really see that kind of long history of how these two things, monsoon and mobility, whether it is on land, whether it is on the seas, deep ocean travel, coastal travel, whatever it is, it's really what has shaped all of these different regional rainscapes or landscapes, which I'm now calling rainscapes. So how would you approach this? I was just asking myself, and that's something I tend to do because of my background, as Kuntala said. I come from architecture and urban planning background. So for me, any kind of theorizing or sort of conceptualizing needs to be also empirically grounded, and one needs to think about what is, how do you make a difference? So I started thinking about it, and I got some ideas that potentially would be workable, but under the prevailing kind of arrangements that are there in terms of dealing with environmental issues, the political and economic arrangements. I don't think that the ideas that I'm going to suggest are ever going to be implemented. So I'm not having any romantic ideas about, you know, people are going to leap up and clap their hands and take my ideas and say, let's run with it. So, you know, I was very struck actually when I read this book that Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dakunya put together called Soak, and how they said that, you know, the monsoons have been happening all the time. Everyone knows that in Mumbai, when the rainy season comes, it's going to rain, it's going to be heavy rain. But from 2005 onwards, suddenly it became a problem. Flooding became a problem, and they started looking at it. How does something as understandable and predictable and expectable, as it were, I mean, not the right word, but anyways, something that one knows is going to happen, how does it become a problem? And then they go through it and they come up with ideas of how one needs to think about that landscape as one where one needs to, rather than managing a flood and trying to control it, to think of how you soak that, how you create an environment or build or design an environment that allows the water to soak rather than become a problem of flooding. And you know, that idea I think is compelling, whether you think about how Gurgaon has been you know, become a problem where when it rains it floods, and places like Bangalore and Chennai have those problems, or they have water shortage. So when you think about these places and you think of them as, okay, these are rainscapes of particular kinds or typologies, or, you know, which are linked to the region. In, you know, these urban areas are linked to regions in a particular way. How would you think about creating a landscape or a rainscape that adapts or takes this into account, rather than seeing it as a problem, sees a way of accommodating and making the landscape rich and flourishing with that kind of that rain that gives life and creates and defines our worlds. So one of the things that came up is in my mind was, you know, the classic kind of Panchayati Raj institutions that came out of the 73rd and 74th amendments to the Constitution about, you know, local government, elected local governments, and decision making at the local level. And in many cases, and there are people who've looked at this also, some of the New Generation Network scholars who were there at the AII, they have, you know, looked at the possibility of you know, climate resilience or planning for climate at that local government level, at the panchayati level, how they could do it, using existing programs like the Manrega, the National Rural Employment Guarantee scheme, and they could actually, instead of just repairing things, that there could be local knowledge and information and advice on how one could sort of think about, you know, organizing the way in which the water, the rain, the runoff, and how you recharge groundwater, or you create areas where the water can soak, or where it needs to flow, where it needs to collect, and how it needs to flush out. All of these things become important when you think about these kinds of landscapes. For urban areas, you know, one of the new initiatives that that I looked at recently was, how the government has been putting forward this smart city initiative, and there are lots of problems with it. And right now, I'm not quite sure how much they have been really implemented. A lot of it was just about, putting in bids and creating these what they call special purpose vehicles with consulting companies to kind of come up with ideas, and most of them have to do with really small projects, kind of demonstration projects of some IT innovation, some solar lamps or whatever. But rather, I was just thinking that if there was some way of taking existing urban renewal and urban management programs and modifying them, because there are already structures there of local organizations that can be brought in, local knowledge, government organizations and others that can come together. And if they could actually be funded in the kind of way that the urban renewal programs were being funded, then the focus, rather than on creating one street with solar lamps or whatever IT innovation, if they could actually think of smartness in a different way and think about rainfall and rainscapes, and actually think about how these places, which are always having so-called water problems of one form or the other, whether it's flooding or shortage or stagnation or whatever, they could come up with projects which could be actually implemented by both local and migratory labor, how all of them could work out, design and implement them in different ways compared to what goes on right now. So these are the sorts of thoughts that came up in my mind. They're rough thoughts, but I'm happy to actually chat with you about them, because they're just ideas in the making. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I think I'll probably stop right now. So these are sort of my ideas on how we might want to think about environmental issues from a different way. So I think I'll stop now, Kuntala, and hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Horipriya. That was a fabulous lecture. Absolutely. You said that these are ideas in the making, but I think you already have quite a few solid ideas in that presentation, and it's putting my brain on fire. And I as far as I think the four themes that are coming out very strongly to me, and before I open the floor for Q&A, just a few comments. The first point that hit me hard is, and I have written about it as well, that the valorization of land over water, and not only water in terms of rivers, but this total invisibilization of this big body of water that is just in our backyard. And that's this live, as you say, humane ocean, the live thing that is a colonial, as Rohan D'Souza says, it's a colonial construction, and then post-colonial times have not deviated from that. So there's this one thing, that valorization of land, and which has sort of invisibilized the Indian Ocean. The second theme that I felt was coming out very strongly from your talk was the rainscapes, the monsoon and society, how interlinked they are. 2/3 of the global population is dependent on the monsoons. And if you look at the work that has been done, it's all scientific work, that looks at how monsoons would change and how monsoons would, due to climate change, and how, these uh, connections exist. But excepting one work that I have read, Mayank Kumar, the book was published from Manohar in Delhi, and it's a beautiful study about how the political society, the administrators, the rajas in colonial times, they understood in Rajasthan context, that although we talk about this, whether the scarcity is, human construction or not, but there were politics involved there, and in protecting the people, monsoon proofing agriculture by the zamindars and the administrators. So there's this monsoon society interaction that is largely untapped as well. And then the third theme that came through to me, at least, is that, the land and water interactions. There is literature after literature from atmospheric scientists about land and atmosphere connections in monsoons, but nothing on land and water interactions, with putting monsoon at the heart of it. And lastly, of course, how, the how monsoons connect these, diverse lands and diverse peoples. As I said, it's 2/3 of the world, and it's the ultimate epitome of mobility. It's this vast mass of water vapor moving over various water bodies and land as well. And absolutely, this here we see the land, water, and air, atmosphere, totally connected through monsoon. So these are the four, strands of thought that came to me. Would you like to respond to them as other people get prepared for questioning? And please feel free to write your questions on the chat box here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kuntala. I'm glad that you feel the ideas are working. Yeah, I think that reading your work and reading a lot of the work of the people that I've mentioned, I really sort of feel I started thinking about this more intensely, that sort of monsoon, the land and water connection, the fluidity, especially all the work that you've been doing around that, the soil, the land that appears, the land that subsides, the silt that moves, and the work that people are doing in Bangladesh also. All, it's really important stuff that made me think harder about how we might shift the way we talk about these environmental issues like climate change, because the discourse is really so driven by this national kind of, how is the national position in relation to the IPCC and carbon emissions and this, that, and the other, without actually looking at what's actually happening on the ground, and how many people have figured out ways of adapting, and they are doing it right now, and instead of recognizing and learning and also working with these people to come up with newer ideas of how you might manage these waterscapes and rainscapes, what you end up doing is making victims out of some of these people who operate in these environments, and basically saying they're marginal, they're doing all these dreadful, these things, they're very vulnerable. So you displace them, you move them out, and And you say you're doing it for their own good, which is the classic thing that all colonial people did, and what development people do is that they say it's for your own good, and then they just, you know, take charge of people's lives in the most unthinking way possible. But anyways, that apart, I was actually struck. I'm so glad that you put the, you know, your first point about how the Indian Ocean has been made invisible. I'm so glad you made that point, because as someone who's been working from that Indian Ocean perspective, I just found it so amazing that so much of the thinking that goes on in is so parochial, it's so land-based, it's so territorial. And it's about territorial control rather than actually saying, you know what, this place is always, if the Indian subcontinent has its diverse and rich culture, it is because of this kind of mobility, and it is because of the movements around the Indian Ocean, and it's because of the monsoons. I don't understand how you have such a dominant kind of social and cultural sensibility towards the monsoons, the Bollywood rain, you know, sequences, you name it, you know. And yet, such a complete lack of understanding and disregard in terms of the landscape. So anyways, I think we should just, I think it'd be good to take some questions here.
Yes, I have asked in the chat box for people to ask questions.
Well,
yeah, I'll once, you know, whilst people get their thoughts, you know, sort of gelled and ready, because you threw out quite a lot of ideas, Haripriya, and for people who are not dealing with this on an everyday basis, might be a little, you know, sort of hard. And what I liked about your presentation was also the denationalization aspect. And people think about denationalization is as the state taking over, yeah, indeed, land-based resources that were taken up by the state as, you know, belonging as the state's own, you know, sort of inheritance, a patrimony. There, you're talking about adopting a broader view, you know, not just focused on one nation, but think about these multiple nations that are, you know, and innumerable people. You know, you think about the numbers of people involved here. This is phenomenal, and how this is all woven through the mobility of a, you know, highly mobile system, movement of a highly mobile system.
yeah.
You know, monsoon is, we talk about monsoon as such a just a system, but what we forget is that it's also moving across land and oceans continuously.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, you know, anything I go back and I look at historical work or anything, you know, it's always about, you know, people, whether it's about trade or whatever, people kind of gearing up, figuring out, okay, when are we going to take off from India to Africa? When are we going to return, and how are we going to hit Southeast Asia in time for getting our, you know, so the ships and the kinds of ships that move goods, move people, that the ships that come into the Bay of Bengal, how they have to time themselves to come into the Bay of Bengal or sail on from Sri Lanka down to Java. It's just incredible how much of that is to do with people just, and mind you, these are people of all cultures, all kinds of interests and backgrounds, whether they're from east coast of Africa or further inland or Arabia or whatever, you know. And we talk about, you know, diversity in India, but I mean, that diversity is the product of all of this kind of cultural movement and landscape making, and it's so driven by the monsoons. I mean, you know, the more, you know, however much you read about the Indian Ocean, that whole kind of drama, and I think that somebody like Amitav Ghosh, he captures it so well. He captures it so well, both at a kind of Bay of Bengal scale as well as the bigger Indian Ocean scale. I think he's like really remarkable in that sense when he does it. And when I think about, even the boating technologies, people like Lotika Varadarajan, I don't know if you know of her work, but I mean, she did some incredible work about the kind of boating technologies and sailing technologies of traditional communities around along the littoral, the Indian coastline, and the kind of boats that you needed to go, whether it was, depending where you were going, whether you're going up the rivers in the Bengal Delta or, the deeper rivers or deeper channels, how you negotiated. All of this was so intimately tied to this kind of waterscape and rivers and rain.
Absolutely. And then you get this contextual information as well. Exactly what you said, that Arabian Sea is quite a different sea to the Bay of Bengal. Bay of Bengal is the rough, and stormy and sea. And if you go to the eastern coast of Indian Peninsula, the boats that you see are quite, you will feel that they're quite rudimentary. They're made of wood, and they don't have these elaborate decorations as do the southwestern coast of India's boats. Boats that go into Arabian Sea, the dhows and the Kerala boats, they are many more intricate. And that reason is that Arabian Sea is a calmer sea. And one could invest in the boats with the certainty that they would come back home. Whereas Bay of Bengal is a rough sea, and one wouldn't invest in the boats, but make them sturdy, not invest in making them works of art so that you can guarantee that they come back home, or you're not losing that, artwork time if they don't.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some incredibly rich insights that you get. I don't know if many people have come across the work of what's his name, Villiers. What's his first name? I've just forgotten. It's just blank. Huh?
J. It begins with J.
I can't. Anyways, Alan Villiers, I think his name. Yeah. His description, because he spent almost 6 to 8 months in a dhow, on going from pretty much from Kuwait, Yemen, all the way down to East Africa, and he talks about the different kinds of boats and the boat technologies and even in the dhows, they're not small vessels. Sometimes they're huge vessels, and you'd have somebody actually making another boat inside, another sailing boat inside the dhow as the ship sailed across these different ports. And he'd talk about, the various business people that you'd meet, the Indian traders, the Indian ships, the Persian ships, the ships that came from Southeast Asia, and all of that, And if you go even now to Gujarat, and you go to Kutch, Mandvi, and places like that, you have so-called quote-unquote country boats that are being built. They are wooden boats, but they have GPS. They're huge, about 200-ton boats. And they do country trade. That means what they call country trade, which is much more kind of regional, and they can't go further south than Tanzania, but no, Mozambique. They're not allowed to go down to South African waters. Country boats are not allowed there. So they still use the monsoon cycles to travel and do regional trade. And it's very critical for them, like, you know, the government decides when they can and can't travel. So even though the monsoon patterns may have changed, you have this situation where some of these country boats want to depart because otherwise they'll lose their money in some of the critical trade, and then the government kind of prevents them from going because they say, no, it's not the right time, even though they know the weather system better to be able to make that decision to travel. They're not allowed to travel. So there are all these kinds of really interesting things, and it keeps looping back to the way people move, you know. Even when these guys go out on these long sea voyages and they come back during the monsoon season, settle debts, deal with their family, you know, staff, whatever, you know, food and, you know, little plots of land that they're growing. So it's like really, really quite fascinating when you look at it that way.
Yeah, there is a question from Nalani Henayake. She is from Sri Lanka. It's in the chat box. Should I read it out? She says, thanks for your inspiration to rethink monsoons in a different way. I really like the idea of rainscapes rather than talking about floods. However, would you think that we in South Asia are more territorial and land-based because of our geopolitical insecurities, because protecting the territory or the state has become the priority? And she is a geographer from Sri Lanka, Nalani Henayake.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Nalini, for this excellent observation and thoughts. And, you know, I think you're right. I think the post-colonial states in South Asia have chosen to embrace that kind of colonial mentality of being, you know, territorial, and it's, you know, and being obsessed about territory and geopolitics the way, you know, the colonial guys did it. And also I think that because of that whole introduction of thinking about, you know, because under colonial rule, landed property became something that they wanted and they focused on, that whole, because that was a way of generating revenue and profit. So they just wanted to, you know, that focus on territory and that focus on owning it and separating water and land. And many scholars have done this, including Kuntala, of course, have shown this obsession of separating water from land, looking at water as a resource, and then trying to see how you can get money out of that and see how you can get money out of land. This whole obsession with territory and territorial resource extraction and territorial, you know, that kind of mentality is why I think people don't look at land as you know, in that kind of more integrated, that holistic, that way that I think we need to today, more so than ever. We can't afford to just keep thinking in these sort of geopolitical ways about, you know, climate change solutions and saying, you know, what is our commitment to reducing carbon emissions, and how do we get all these fishermen whose lives are in danger, how do we get them out of there and send them to cities so that they can become paupers over there or whatever, you know? I just think that we really need to, I don't think our governments are going to, the governments are going to think in that way. But I think as geographers, as scholars, as activists, as people who work with communities on the ground, I think this is where you need to kind of find opportunities to change the way we think. I mean, you know, I'm sure if we looked, you know, and I'm sure you know it in Sri Lanka, but I know any number of really, really creative and smart and really committed people who work with water in India, in Bangalore, in, you know, Chennai, in every place. You know, they think about this, just like Dilip Dakunya and Anuradha have done in Mumbai. They're thinking in really creative ways of how you can manage a waterscape and how you can think about the monsoons and those cycles and you know, if you like, climate proof it also. But what we need is some kind of way that the existing, you know, urban and regional or rural institutions, state institutions, you know, are willing to create that little space for people to do those things, rather than just, you know, talk about small projects. You know, think about it slightly, in a slightly larger way. And I just know people who are already trying to do this and are pushing and pushing and pushing and trying to make it work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a great response to and great good question, Nalani. So if there are no other questions, then we are, you know, sort of kind of ready to wind up here. Is that okay?
I'm fine.
Okay, good. Nalani, you are also a geographer. Haripriya, you were trained as an architect, but you are located in a geography department and
Yes.
School of Geography. And I was ancient history now, but still originally trained as a human geographer. I think, you know, all of us probably have read one book, you know, the Oscar Spade's book, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And in that book, the 2-volume book, he starts, you know, published sometime in the 60s or 70s probably. And Oscar Spade, who's an, you know, lived most of his life in Australia, originally British, and died in Australia, he starts his book by saying that, you know, in the agriculture chapter, that Indian agriculture is a gamble of the monsoons. And we have strangely taken everyone for you know, taken monsoons for granted, and the links between monsoons and you know, the human society, and how these societies have moved around with the monsoons, we have kind of forgotten over the years. And maybe, Haripriya, you will revive that with, you know, and today what you presented is just the beginning of that exploration. And that will be a great addition to your already rich body of work on the Indian Ocean. And with that, I wanted to say thank you to the audience for listening to this wonderful exposition on denationalizing Indian environmental issues by Dr. Haripriya Rangan. And Haripriya, thank you so much for this beautiful talk. Very interesting, absolutely thought-provoking, and insightful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kuntala. And yes, thank you for your encouragement. Just hope I can work this through. Yeah, thank you.